What's up, composers? This is a follow-up to my previous lesson on form, how composers think about musical form. And in this second part about musical form, I'm going to show you how you can take a particular musical idea and develop it over a much longer period of time. Form is one of the most essential elements of composing. And if you can learn to get the form right, you're going to take your music to the next level in a pretty big way. A lot of the time when a composer will start out, they will focus the majority of their attention on the minutia, on the details, on the second-to-second relationships between notes and rhythms. And this is great. This is going to be one of the most essential aspects of actually generating material and establishing what the idea actually is. But at a certain point, you're going to have to figure out what the actual journey these elements are going to go on. Now, the journey can mean many things. And that's actually what makes form the most exciting and the most enriching aspects of being a composer. It's like storytelling. You can start with the same set of elements, the same characters, the same settings, and arrive at a dramatically different place than any other writer because of the unique perspective that you yourself have as an individual and as a creator. So while focusing on the details is going to be a really important and crucial phase of actually composing, you also need to make sure that you're dedicating enough attention to zooming out and looking at the overall impression that these elements are actually going to be leaving on your listener, because that's what they're actually going to take away from the musical experience. They're going to remember the longer term relationships that you create between these things. That's what's actually going to make the experience of the piece rich for them. The contrasts, the changes, the transformations, the juxtapositions. And so we need to devote a lot of attention to make this musical journey over time really powerful. Now, how do we actually achieve that? So in order to demonstrate how I would do this in a piece of music myself, I'm going to use a pre-existing texture that I developed in the previous lesson. This is exactly how I would start composing. And so I'm going to take this idea of a cello quartet playing an arpeggiated tutti pizzicato chord with some spaces in between that we can fill with a pizzicato hocket or other variations of this idea. So how do we actually take these ideas and build a form with them? One of the things that I like to do once I establish where the music is going to live in terms of its texture, in terms of the actual materials I'm going to use, even before I make decisions about specific rhythms or specific pitches, specific dynamics and all that, is to create a crude visual representation of what that's going to sound like so that I can start to ask questions about where those things can go. And this is specifically because I'm thinking about form and the longer term developments I'm going to subject this material to. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the pre-existing texture that I established in a previous lesson for cello quartet, where they're going to be alternating between a tutti arpeggiated chord and a hocket with microtonal deviations between each of the different players. Now, if I were to create a visual representation of this, I would simply draw what the main elements are. In this case, I have the tutti arpeggio, and then I have the hocket, which is microtonal, etc. And I would put pizzicato here. And I might label this part as the hocket. So in this way, I can basically, in a nutshell, summarize what the essential texture is going to be. And later on, at a different point in the compositional process, I can establish what the actual rhythms are going to be. When you want to start actually thinking about form, it's really important for you to start thinking about what is actually happening and what can you do to change what is happening. So what's happening right now, if we describe this, is there is an arpeggio that's happening where all four players play at the same time, and then they play individually, separate times, different notes. And the articulation is going to be short on these notes. So you can say that the first thing is legato, where it's like, and the second thing is staccato. So what can you do to change this? Well, legato can become staccato, and staccato can become legato. Now, how can it become legato? It could be either pizz or arco. If it becomes arco, it could be straight notes, it could be tremolo notes, it could be like ricocheted notes. So I'm already starting to think about directions that this could go if you follow these particular journeys. Let's say that you want to set up a situation where you're going to go from short pizzicato to ricochet. I have now established what a longer term trajectory is going to be for my initial texture. And it's also going to go from pizzicato to arco. And there are a lot of ways that you can actually execute this in time. You could do this gradually, where you calculate a certain number of beats apart where you start introducing particular elements, or you can do it on a more intuitive way. But this would be one way of gradually changing the overall texture without really changing substantially what the core elements are going to be. In other words, the rhythm and the pitches can basically stay the same, but if you change the actual articulation and the timbre, that's going to have an impact on the development. Now, you can also change the rhythms themselves and the pitches themselves. So let's say that the main notes that you're going to have are, for example, you're going to make C the centric point. So this is similar to what I did in the previous lesson, where like the centric point for the majority of those pizzicato hockets was like around C. So you have like C, C quarter sharp, D quarter flat, B. It's basically everything pointing around a C. Now, let's say that you want to emphasize the distance between C and D, or C and D quarter flat. Let's just make these the two poles that we're trying to connect. You can then say, well, this small whole step is going to be what I use as the basic interval of transposition between large groups of music. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a literal whole step. You could actually decide that it's just interval class 2, if we want to use sort of like set theory or pitch class theory terminology. We can say that we're going to distance larger blocks of music by an interval class of 2, plus or minus an octave, or however far away you want. You can do it plus 2 octaves, minus 2 octaves, plus 3 octaves, minus 2 octaves. And that's going to be a pretty significant contrast relative to the first starting point. So if you do that at the same time as you're creating this trajectory from pizzicato to arco, short to ricochet, that's going to create a significant journey for the listener to go on. And this is just one path that we're exploring, using this very simple interval of transposition and this very simple trajectory of texture. In the past lesson, I also talked about beat groupings. So let's say that in the middle ground, we're going to have these distances of, and I'm just going to reinvent whatever the distances are. Let's say that we're going to have something like 6, 4, 3, 2, 6, 5, 6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's say that these are our beat groupings. Now, you'll notice that as I start to get further and further along, I'm accelerating or making closer together these beat groupings. So we can combine these processes where each of these would be articulated with an arpeggio, and in between we would have the hocket. So we can create this journey in this way. At the same time, we're going to start pizzicato and gradually get to arco. And we're going to have short impulses that gradually become ricochets. And at the same time, we're going to actually take our interval of transposition, start out on C, and gradually go to D quarter flat as our pitch center. So this is how you could take a simple idea and subject it to a longer term musical process. Now, obviously, there are many, many things that you can do in terms of the formal development of an idea. This is just one thing that I made up basically on the spot, where I'm taking this idea, asking questions about how the sound is behaving, and figuring out what the spectrum is for the various parameters of this idea. In other words, we have the arpeggiated chord, and then we have the microtonal pizzicato hocket, where we have these short impulses that are happening out of sync. So you can just ask questions about what you can do to these various elements. So for example, you can accelerate the beat groupings like we did. You can decelerate the beat groupings. So if you were to start with like closer together beat groupings and go in the opposite direction so that they become further and further apart, and you get this gradual expansion of those inner zones where you have these shorter blips. And then if you do that, what could you do to make the space feel different? You could elongate those blips. What if they start to become unison? What if those blips actually start to become far enough apart that they start to feel like a replacement for those arpeggiated chords? And then they've just become single 2T impulses. That would be one transformation, right? What if you start from a single note, let's say C again, and gradually start to increase the distance between them so they start to wedge apart? Then you can create sort of emergent patterns where they're playing greater and greater distances away from each other, and that's creating its own sort of like out of phase arpeggio. And so you're sort of illuminating the nature of the Hocket to be some kind of reflection of that initial 2T arpeggio chord. In other words, they're related and they are the same because you're showing a trajectory that's establishing this relationship between them. You could also change the way the pizzicato is performed. You could say that it starts off really quiet and then gradually becomes super loud where you have snap pizzicati. So it's changing the dynamic trajectory and it's changing the timbral trajectory. You could also decide that rather than just have these little blips, you could layer in more information, more kinds of events. So you could have these short bursts of tremolo, you could have little melodies that emerge out of them. What if instead of just having like a simple blip, like a single impulse, we have like a trill or some kind of ornamentation of the blip? You could then say, well, the trajectory is basically going to be from that initial singular blip to something much more ornamented and melodic. So in other words, we have transformations of pitch where we transpose entire blocks of music so that we can create contrast in register. We can have contrast in rhythm where things either get closer together or further apart, not just on the single superficial level, but also on the middle ground and the deeper levels. So you could have like entire sections that become contracted, and then you just get these big sorts of contrasts between a lot of different sorts of elements. So let's say that you've sort of established that initial kind of texture where you have the arpeggiated chord and then these pizzicato blips. Then you develop that into the ricochet version of that. Then you develop that into a legato lush harmony version of that. Then you develop that into some other kind of transformation that you've subjected these elements to. And then what you're going to do at a certain point is you're going to contract all of these so that they become smaller, sort of like juxtapositions and showing sort of like a faster alternation between these various dimensions or versions of this idea. And so you're sort of like cutting between all of these different layers to sort of show the listener all of the various journeys you've taken them on, and then you can sort of reverse engineer it and like spread them apart again. There are a lot of different options to create a long-term trajectory, and that's what's going to make the piece memorable. It's not the superficial details. If you just write the arpeggiated chords with a pizzicato Hocket, maybe people will remember that. Maybe. But it's more likely that they're going to remember the longer term relationships that you create and the transformation of those elements. Because basically that texture is kind of anonymous. It doesn't really have a lot of personality. What does have a personality is how you actually decide to distribute them over a much grander scale of time. And that doesn't necessarily mean 3 hours of music. It could be 5 minutes. It could be 10 minutes. It can be 1 minute. But the main takeaway that I would like for you to have from this is that you need to be asking questions about what you can actually subject the materials to and what are the spectrums of difference between things. So short to long, long to short, loud to soft, soft to loud, high to low, low to high, all of these different things. And pretty much any kind of idea or concept is going to have an opposite. Right? It's kind of impossible for something not to have an opposite. Even if you think about a word like paradox, the opposite of a paradox is something logical that completely makes sense. So we have to think about these sorts of spectra of difference and change so that we can start to extrapolate longer term trajectories for our ideas. You can do this in pretty much any kind of context, any kind of musical setting. So think about what is happening in the music. Is it together? Then what's the opposite of together? Separate. Is it noisy? What's the opposite of noisy? Well, transparent or clean or pure, right? And I'm referring specifically to like frequency when I talk about noise. So if it's mostly harmonics, what's the opposite of a harmonic? You can see now how you can very easily create difference by just describing what is actually happening. You don't need to have a super complex idea to actually create an interesting formal trajectory. I hope this lesson was valuable, and I hope that you learned something from this. If you've been enjoying these videos and you're learning from them, then feel free to like and subscribe so you don't miss any more. I'm going to be continuing to develop my music theory and music composition courses, so make sure you're keeping an eye out for those videos. Make sure that if you are interested in learning and you're interested in being part of a community, I've created a free school community that you can join today, 100% for free, where you're going to continue to see these videos, these updates. You're going to also become part of a tight-knit community of composers looking to improve their skills in a supportive environment. And if you want to take your music to the next level, then what you can do is you can book a one-on-one call for me, which is basically going to be a consultation to see if I can help you to achieve your goals as a composer. If you're interested in doing something like that, I'll leave a link in the description for it. You can book a call with me on my Calendly, and you can just find a time that works for you so that you can have a free consultation and see if I can help you to achieve your goals as a composer. I'll see you in the next lesson.